Over the past 2 weeks, British broadcasters have devoted hours of airtime to the Gulf War, but is saturation coverage painting a true picture? Good evening. Last night, The Late Show looked at the way other countries were reporting the Gulf War. Tonight, we turn to the coverage in Britain. Over the past fortnight, we've witnessed some of the most extraordinary scenes ever broadcast on television. Apparently, we have watched the Gulf War unfolding in front of our eyes. We've had a vicarious sensation of the attack, missiles being launched, the shock of seeing and hearing them land, the pilot's view of the target. But as the novelty of these pictures wears off, there are nagging doubts. Do we really know what's going on? Are the instant images actually giving us a false picture? Certainly, the amount of information seems to bear little relation to the amount of programming. The hours of Gulf specials, Gulf news and Gulf roundups over the past 2 weeks have been a mix of news, analysis, rumour and speculation on a scale not previously seen on television. The initial success of cable news network CNN has added to the pressure on ITV and the BBC to be constantly on air and constantly updating the news or no news from the Gulf. In a few minutes, I'll be discussing the effect of this saturation coverage with the television critic Mark Lawson, the journalist and war correspondent John Pilger, Andrew Neil, the editor of the Sunday Times and former executive chairman of Sky Television, Christopher Graham, BBC Television's managing editor of news programmes, Phillip Knightley, author of the classic study of military censorship, The First Casualty, and John Simpson, BBC Television's correspondent in Baghdad when the Allied attack began. But first, Mark Lawson on the wall-to-wall coverage of the past 2 weeks.
With me in the studio now are Colonel Andrew Duncan of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, Air Marshal Sir Michael Armitage, and Dr. John Gilbert, former Defence Minister.
In the meantime, I have with me here Admiral Sir James Eberle, former Director of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and also Wing Commander David Brinkman.
I'm joined first by Air Commodore Alistair Mackey, who fought for the RAF during the Second World War.
Well, Tony Mason and I are joined by General Sir John Akehurst, former Deputy Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. Sir John.
Good evening. Those retired generals who've been filling our screens for the last 2 weeks had a standard comparison for the scale of the Allied bombardment of Baghdad. 2 Dresdens, or 1.5 Hiroshimas. But it was hard for the viewer to be impressed. We were distracted by another new phenomenon of warfare. Here they came, wave after wave of military pundits, in the greatest display of saturation waffling in history.
How long do you expect this phase of the war to continue?
Well, I'm sure it will take at least a day or two to be quite confident that our ground forces can move without interference from Iraqi air.
Perhaps you'd like to draw in on here where the defences of Kuwait are.
One of the interesting aspects of the Iraqis' capabilities or lack of capabilities is that they're not very good at night fighting.
You have what we can simplify by saying static defences.
Admiral Sir James Eberle, former head of Defence Intelligence, you must have been very surprised by those pictures.
What is so impressive is that this technology is so successful under operational conditions.
Ironically, just as military technology has made bombing more focused, if General Schwarzkopf's state-of-the-art movies are to be believed, the technology of broadcasting has done exactly the opposite for reporting. Once limited to precision bulletins, the broadcasters are now able to blanket bomb. The problem is that the grammar of television news has been dangerously disrupted. TV is constructed in fixed lengths, hence the dark and secret art of scheduling. The most familiar segments are 30 minutes for a sitcom, 1 hour for a play, and 30 minutes for a news bulletin on an averagely bloody peacetime day. These fixed lengths can be broken. The news might be extended by 10 or 20 minutes because of terrorism in this country or a small war in another. And occasionally there might be programmes swollen to anything from 4 to 24 hours, a World Cup final, a general election night special, a telethon. The viewer instinctively understands these rules and is guided by them as to how concerned to be. However, during the demise of Margaret Thatcher, television broke this contract. Schedules and bulletins were stretched, not because of developments on a particular day, but because of a general air of momentousness.
We return to Lance Price now in Downing Street. Lance, is there any indication so far who the candidate from the cabinet might be?
No, there isn't.
The point is that there's nothing inherently odd about David Dimbleby sitting in a TV studio for 18 hours. But the viewers knew that he did it once every few years and that something extraordinary had happened, be it an election or a royal wedding. But during the war, a news special has become a news ordinary. The broadcaster's signalling of significance has broken down. This was partly a result of euphoria over the early victories. Televisions, I mean, not the militaries. Who in the first few days was not seduced by the novelty of channel hopping through World War III?
Now we just heard, whoa, holy cow. That was a large airburst that we saw. It was filling the sky with dust.
And I think, John, that airburst took out the telecommunications. Yeah, now you may hear the bombs now. If you're still with us, you can hear the bombs now. They are hitting the center of this city.
The liberation of Kuwait has begun. In conjunction with the forces of our coalition partners, the United States has moved under the code name Operation Desert Storm.
This was tremendous. Baghdad was lit up like a Christmas tree.
Then suddenly the launch of a Patriot ground-to-air interceptor. It sped upwards into the clouds and hit the incoming Scud.
There are sounds of planes overhead. We don't know whose planes there are, but air raid sirens are going off insistently. There are military convoys on both sides of me. We're being told to get off this platform and get inside into the air raid shelter immediately. But right now, everyone's been training for this, and it looks like we may have to.
All right, Charles Jaco, that doesn't mean that he is in any imminent danger. Of course, we can't know that. He does have a place of shelter to which to go, and that's where we believe he is going.
Correspondents behind enemy lines, generals with home videos to prove that they weren't hitting any homes. It was thrilling stuff. It was naturally assumed by reporters that even the Allied High Command was relying on TV.
General Horner, as you probably know, the Iraqis have been censoring and limiting the broadcast of television reports from Baghdad. To what extent were those television reports beneficial to you in evaluating the success of the air campaign?
I really don't know because I don't have a TV set down at my command center.
It was like an H.M. Bateman cartoon, the man who wasn't watching CNN. The commander of the Allied Air Forces was forced onto the defensive.
But in retrospect, after getting a chance to look at some of the playbacks, I think I'm going to put a television set in.
Television has been accused of many crimes in its short life, but at this point in the war, it was possible to claim for it a moral victory. Television gives blood and biographies to troops who now even speak about the D word.
You're frightened of failure, you're frightened of dying. Oh, it's everything.
This is bad news for generals who've always depended on the anonymity of the dead, the inability of any of us really to identify with those blown up. But in this conflict, the latest airman posted missing might be someone who's just been speaking to us. The concept of cannon fodder, either of the Allied military or of Iraqi civilians, is harder to sustain, and I would credit television for that achievement. But I think it is necessary to worry about whether what we're being offered is war as entertainment, the Eastern theatre of conflict as the Western cinema of war. It's not hard to imagine the following scene from CNN as it might appear in a future Gulf War movie, with Jack Lemmon as the solid anchorman and Dustin Hoffman as the impetuous reporter.
Blair, I'd just like to strongly urge you, and I'm passing on the instructions of Bob Fernand, our senior executive producer. Do not, don't open the window if you would, please.
Go ahead. I can't hear him. I need to... I'll tell you now.
Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes, I do hear you. Just Larry has to put on his mask.
Yes, please pass along instruction not to open that window, please.
It's precisely this kind of scene which explains CNN's success. Live, raw reporting that conveys the experience of a Scud attack in a way which a subsequent filleted news report, when we know the outcome, could never do. The international sympathy for Israel was almost certainly attributable to pictures like these.
The glass exploded. All of us didn't know what to do. My father, I called an ambulance for him, which took him to the hospital. My mother fainted. Everything's a mess.
More worrying was the way in which the new fractured grammar of British television was forced to deal with this footage. Studio panels constructed to fill the empty schedules were forced to discuss successive rumours. The trend towards more analysis in television news, particularly on the BBC, is often welcome, but analysis needs a basis of fact. During the war, experts have been left writing in sand, their expertise therefore devalued.
From America, it's still too early to get official comments from there, although one official is suggesting that 100 airfields have been hit in the night bombing and the morning bombings. I didn't know they had 100 airfields, but that's...
the figure was 40.
They seem to have found rather more than we thought, but that's what they're saying.
No doubt you weren't able to hear what was being said here in the studio, but Hazir Taimourian of the Times was saying that he believed from his sources that Saddam Hussein never believed the Allies would actually go to war against him, were convinced that that wouldn't actually happen, and must be suffering a terrible sense of shock and surprise that it has actually happened. Would you concur with that?
No, I wouldn't. That was never my understanding.
The BBC and ITN, two of the foremost news-gathering organisations in the world, were reduced to the process known in journalism as copy-tasting, sifting agency reports without any idea of their accuracy. The panellists identified the problem before the broadcasters did.
I don't know about your viewers, but as we've had so many conflicting reports, I'm beginning to wonder what we're all doing here.
Marshall McLuhan, who sounds like another retired soldier but isn't, said that the media made the world a global village. But here we have the gossip round the global parish pump, and harmful gossip for those with family in Israel or in the forces. For years, organisations like the Glasgow Media Group have complained about the way news is selected for transmission. 2 minutes for this, 3 minutes for that, oh God, not the poll tax again. But the war coverage has demonstrated that raw, untreated news has its own dangers, simply because it may not be news.
But we have just got a report that 3 more missiles have fallen in the north of Israel. We don't know if there's a chemical warhead there or not. There's been an announcement on the radio that all citizens should put their gas masks on. They should stay in their sealed rooms, which would normally be in a high place in their building. They should not go down to the basement, to the bomb shelters, which is where you go for conventional war. So it's clear that the Israeli government is fearing, well, it's happening, as we know, gas wars.
News of a multiple missile attack on Israel has raised fears of chemical weapons being used. In fact, we know that some chemical weapons have been used and that Israel has declared a state of war.
Still an enormous degree of confusion here, Martin, and probably some hours yet before we know exactly what's going on. I should say that the alert seems to have decreased somewhat in Jerusalem. There have been no missile strikes around here, and we have been told that we can take our gas masks off.
8 Iraqi Scud missiles hit targets in Israel. There were initial fears of chemical attack, but the warheads did not carry gas.
There's also been criticism by those opposed to the war that broadcasting has unequivocally supported the conflict. I don't agree. No one could call the coverage impartial, but even the very limited participation of anti-war protesters and the very occasional British Muslim must be accounted in advance. During the Second World War, the BBC operated very much as Baghdad radio does now. Military bulletins, often false from one side only, morale-boosting music and talks. During the Falklands conflict, however, the Argentinian case and claims were reported. This is the approach that's been followed during the Gulf War. But what do we make of headlines such as this?
The Royal Navy sees its first major action of the Gulf War. Lynx helicopters provide cover in an Allied operation which kills 3 Iraqis and captures 22 more.
Is this even-handed reporting of enemy losses, or is he presenting the Iraqi troops as Allied trophies? And when a reporter puts on battle dress and takes the honorary rank of corporal, a chemical change takes place which precludes impartiality. When, after reports that bad weather is hampering the campaign, Martin Bell says,
"The British move is still on schedule and has not been affected by it."
How does he know? Because the army has told him. Shouldn't he say the army claims the move is still on schedule? It's increasingly clear 2 weeks into the war that the Allied forces have presented the pretense of accessibility, the illusion of information. Those viewer-friendly Pentagon frontmen, Dick Cheney and General Colin Powell, will face a choice if they win the war between running for president and selling the Dick and Colin show to a network. They look plausible, but does that mean they are?
At the end of this operation, this phase of the operation, when you get a little better picture, and could you come back or have someone of your staff come back and give us a briefing on it?
We'll be getting regular briefings, and we'll be, as the Secretary said, we're going to be as forthcoming as we possibly can, while at the same time preserving operational security.
Will we discover, when the war is over, that the military have simply become more open in their lying? These are not simple issues. Most journalists accept that a scoop in wartime can be homicide. One of the subtlest questions in politics is, to what extent should a democracy cease to be a democracy when it's at war? It would be wrong if cable television footage fed live from battle zones meant that a mother saw her son's head hanging off on CNN. But it would be equally unacceptable if all edited footage of carnage were banned from transmission because it might affect domestic morale. Television has obligations towards operational security, but it has none towards cheerleading. But there's another obligation, perhaps hardest for the broadcasters themselves to accept, the obligation not to bore people with the war, to make them careless of what's happening. Any exhausted viewer still watching on the second Friday of the war discovered that, despite 4,000 calls of complaint, the BBC's John Burt refused to surrender.
I don't know whether weariness is the right word. I think that when people watch and listen, there will be a range of emotions. There'll be indignation and sadness. I do not myself yet detect any weariness.
It was an achievement of television that the Vietnam War ended because the coverage made the viewing public angry. Whatever you think about the current conflict, it would be a failure of the medium if the Allies were forced to sue for peace just because audiences wanted to see something else on their TV screens.
Well, Mark Lawson raised a number of points, but first of all, Christopher Graham, on the point of the substantive point that we're getting so much coverage that it's boring. Are you conscious that perhaps for the public a lot of this is boring?
Well, I don't think it is, because we know that people are tuning in record numbers to see the programmes. But I think what we've just seen is a rather mischievous report taking a very serious coverage and rather distinguished coverage over the past 2 weeks and reducing it to the level of comic cuts. It's interesting that if you take even the boring bits and cut them together quickly, you get something that is vastly entertaining and fun. But I think it's rather dangerous because the story is important, not because the BBC, for example, has given it, I think you said, an air of general momentousness, but because it is a fundamentally important story, which I think we've been right to cover in full.
But in Mark Lawson's report, he talks about the distorting of what people expect in the news. Now, you're in the position, partly after the CNN's much vaunted ability to stay on the rolling news coverage, to stay on air, simply when nothing's happening, so you'll be on when you catch something. Isn't there a problem that it's difficult for the public now to decide what's important and what's not important when you are on for such long swatches of time?
Well, A, it's got nothing to do with CNN. Secondly, I think it's right that a story is given the length that it's worth, and I think there's nothing sacred about the 9 o'clock news being half an hour. If there's a big story, I think the controllers are prepared to extend the 9 o'clock news, all credit to them. They should. I think the audience can also decide for themselves. It seems to be odd in the extreme to think that you can only give the audience half an hour of news, and if you give them more, you're somehow hyping.
Could I? Yes, come back in
here.
Well,
first of all, I'm sorry you thought it was a mischievous report. I mean, I accept that I'm sitting in London as a television critic, and people are showing extraordinary courage, facing death, making those reports. The cutting together of those clips you may have regarded that as comic. I mean, I didn't do the cutting together, but I hope that the courage came through. No, the point I was making was not that the news should always be half an hour, but that something happened during the coverage of the fall of Margaret Thatcher and during this, which is that if on a certain day, if it's just decided, that's what I meant by general air of momentousness, you say this running story is so big that all the programmes are going to go. There's going to be 2 hours of David Dimbleby morning and afternoon. Now, even with a story as big as this, as big as the fall of Margaret Thatcher, there are going to be days when actually nothing happens. And that's what I was talking about. I wasn't saying it should always be the same. I'm saying that it's a danger to say that it should always be different.
Philip Knightley, from your perspective and the volume of words in television, do you think that they've added to the public's understanding of what actually is going on in the Gulf?
I'm afraid not. I took 12 hours off recently and just sat in front of CNN during that whole period. And at the end of it, having had my senses assailed by sound and pictures and words, I sat down at an empty piece of paper and tried to write down 6 new things that I'd learned about the war.
And how many did you get?
And I only got 1. I would much rather read a good analysis the next morning in a newspaper than see continuous wall-to-wall television, which presents the whole thing a bit like war soap opera.
Well, Andrew, you're providing that not on a daily basis in the newspaper, but obviously in the Sunday Times. You're aiming to provide that. But what do you think about the speculation? Particularly, we saw comic cuts, as Christopher Graham said, but cut together, former military men speculating, often in contradictory terms. Now, do you think that is distracting for the audience?
It's called democratic discourse. I mean, if you get 3 experts, you might get 4 opinions. And I tell you, I could take any program, including The Late Show, and cut it together and have people falling in the aisles. I mean, it's a cheap technique. It's the Clive James school of television criticism, which is amusing but doesn't add to the profound understanding of what's going on. The broadcasters have had a very difficult job in this war. It's probably the most enormous event that most journalists today at the BBC have covered, especially the new generation that has taken over the editing and managing of programs, and journalists too. For many people, it's the biggest event of their journalistic careers since the Second World War. And nobody knew what was going to happen when this war began. We didn't know whether the Iraqi forces were going to pour south into Saudi Arabia. We didn't know what the impact of the bombing would be. We didn't know if the initial American bombing was going to flatten Baghdad. None of this, and so television, I think, rightly was on the air to follow the events. Sometimes they were quiet, so you fill time with pundits, as you're doing tonight. Other times you have real live news. Well, other times you have real live news events to cover, and some of the reporting has been splendid, first-class television reporting. And Mark is right, it is easy to sit in London and make little glib comments about the quality of the journalism. And so far, I think British journalism has come off rather well, particularly broadcast journalism.
But for the very fact that it is something unusual, I think that is a merit in its discussion. And John Simpson, as somebody who's just come back, from your perspective now, looking at the coverage, does anything about it surprise you?
I think just the scope of it does surprise me a little bit, I must say. I do think that it's... there is a tendency, of course, to want to speculate about everything, and because there isn't an awful lot of fact coming out, and not all of it is absolutely, let's face it, 100% certainly fact, there is a tendency to sit down and worry it to pieces, worry each little thing to pieces, yes. It does surprise me a little bit. I mean, you sit out there and you think that, you know, that 2 air raids a day or 3 air raids a day is the big story, and you find that it's something altogether different when you get back.
John Pilger, hasn't John Simpson put his finger on it, though? The problem we have here is there are actually very few facts coming out, and what they're having to be done with them is to be extended in order to fill airtime.
Well, it's how the facts are treated. John Simpson has distinguished himself by the way he's treated the very few facts. He's qualified his statements. He said, made that most courageous of journalistic statements, I don't know. And I think that's at least given us an impression of the, if you like, the paucity of information in Baghdad. On our side, we haven't really had any of those serious doubts. The 9 o'clock news tonight was a striking example. I mean, it was the Norman Schwarzkopf and George Bush show with a bit of Top Gun thrown in. And
But before I put that back to Chris Graham, can you amplify that? I mean, what would you put in its place?
I have no objection to, if you like, wall-to-wall television if it's going to at least tempt to deal with those stories, deal with those issues that haven't been dealt with. Now, it seems to me the most important issue, one of the most important issues at the moment, apart from the land war, is the history of Britain's involvement with supplying arms to Iraq. And I'd like to ask Christopher Graham why we haven't seen the Panorama program that has been so far postponed 3 times, been scheduled 3 times, advertised twice in the Radio Times, and we still haven't seen it. Now, this is a program, I understand, about Britain's involvement in the Iraqi arms trade. Now, this seems to me an important story because it's why we're there.
Let's just ask you, first of all, on the substantive point.
Well,
why hasn't it been shown?
Well, John Pilger asked the question. I don't know why a particular panorama hasn't been shown now. I know why Monday night's programme was as it was, because of the particular job we've done analysing the current state of the battle. I think it was quite right that panorama was doing it.
Well, you replied to that, but just to come back to John Pilger, you were saying,
really.
Well, at the moment I want to talk to you about what you were saying when you talked about the 9 o'clock news being typical, you know, the Schwarzkopf Pentagon briefing.
No doubt.
But in what context do you put that then? I'm not talking particularly about other programmes. I'm saying what would you do better to use that kind of information?
Well, I think it's just showing skepticism, whichever side you're on. I've always thought that a journalist, when confronted by people in authority telling you something, should show skepticism. We had, as one of the clips showed, we had in the beginning people predicting a 6-day war. Yet we've gone along with Schwarzkopf and others in Saudi Arabia as if theirs is the word of God. I mean, the 9 o'clock news today, the main story was the fact that the Iraqis have scared the pants off them almost by getting over there, capturing a town and getting back. Now, that wasn't the way the 9 o'clock news was slanted. It was General Schwarzkopf saying how great everything is.
Schwarzkopf was big on the 9 o'clock news tonight because for the first time the American briefing was actually very detailed. I don't think that our journalists are lacking in asking the right questions about these things, and I think the sort of things that you're concerned with are being raised. We're being constantly accused of rumour and speculation, was the phrase that Kirsty used at the beginning of the programme, yet I would call it analysis. I think that particularly our continuous news programmes are worrying away at some of these issues, and in a situation where the Allied authorities and the Iraqis aren't always particularly keen to give us as full a picture as we'd like, we've got to build up from the known information that's available the picture that we can get from the analysis, and that's where the experts come in.
But why don't
Phillip Knightley, can I just bring in Phillip Knightley here? I mean, you say that you learnt one fact when you sat down and looked at the coverage. Admittedly, you're talking particularly about CNN. But then how do you think that you could alter that? I mean, in the face of what Chris is saying, how could you better the coverage that's going on just now?
I think it's going to be very difficult because I think the British government and the Pentagon made a conscious decision at the start of this war that they were going to manage the news. That after Vietnam, when President Bush, as was shown on the television last night, says this is not going to be another Vietnam, he is in large extent referring to the media. He's not going to allow media reporting to cost the nation the war again.
Well, John Simpson, in the field, how do you deal with these constraints? How do you deal with the pressures of news management from whatever direction?
I think you've just got to forget about it, really, because if you think about that all the time, you'd go crazy, you know? I think you've just got to say what you've seen and try, as John says, to be as sceptical as possible of everything that comes in your direction. That's all. I don't think there's anything else you can. If you start doing too much else, you start really putting the kind of spin on it that you're trying to eradicate from other people.
But aren't you facing problems? You said earlier tonight that you knew 2 hours before the attack on Baghdad took place that it was going to take place. You said you'd heard from a number of sources. Now, what did you do with that information?
Well, I if you want to know, I packed my bag, actually, and got ready and put the old field dressings in and things. I mean, that was all I did with the information. I mean, the trouble is with that sort of stuff that it's not really broadcastable because by its nature, I mean, it's tipping you off about something in the future, and you can't be certain that it's going to be true. So, although I thought it was true because we heard it from French, British, and American sources, I couldn't be certain about it. I mean, I'd have been an absolute idiot to have gone on the air and said, I'm hearing from lots of sources that it's going to happen tonight.
But we have been using unconfirmed reports. Now, Andrew Neil, I'm not asking you to justify what the BBC is doing, but the BBC have had, on occasion, a broadcast which has said such and such is going to happen, particularly that there could be chemical warheads involved in the attack in Israel. That was, of course, withdrawn later. But isn't there a danger with the kind of instant reporting that we're doing that there isn't time to be reflective because others are pressing ahead?
There is a danger. I mean, the wording that Martin Lewis used in the 9 o'clock news was clearly, in retrospect, wrong. I suspect, though, when you've got 10 people shouting in your ear saying, go to this beautiful footage, don't go there, go to something else, no, do this interview, that every journalist, especially journalists who work in front of the TV camera, make mistakes and they're there for all to see. some newspapers made that mistake too, and they had longer to check. The joy of television is if you get something wrong, the moment you know you're still on air, you can correct it. A newspaper edition is printed. One of the papers, at least, had the honesty to correct that particular mistake the following day. I think it is in the nature of this type of coverage you make mistakes. For example, when President Reagan was shot in 1982, Dan Rather, doing the CBS job, similar to what we've seen tonight, said that his press secretary had been killed, Brady, had died. It turned out not to be true. I think, though, although there are great dangers in making mistakes, there are even greater dangers in not doing this at all. People will say, well, why aren't you doing it live? I mean, the very people probably criticising tonight would say, you're not doing it live because you're frightened to show the real figures, the raw footage as it comes in. You want to edit it, you want to package it.
Back to John Simpson.
It seems to be the broadcasters can't win.
We saw clips there from CNN particularly, people under duress, reporters under duress and stress as bombs were falling. I mean, how difficult is it making instant decisions about obviously what you have to put in a piece to camera very quickly, that you don't know the totality of the information, you really just have to go on what you know immediately?
Yeah, but you never do anyway, though, really. I mean, that's one of the wonders of journalism, is that you're dealing with totally inadequate information and you've got to write about it now. It would be great fun to wait for another week.
But we're all looking for some kind of management of this, Mark Lawson. Isn't it the case that perhaps what we have here is just, it's not a plot, it is actually very confused what's happening out there, and all we are doing in television, in radio, in newspapers is reflecting the fact that we actually do not know what's going on. Perhaps the military doesn't not know entirely what's going on.
No, I agree with that. I don't think it is a plot at all. I'm surprised. I mean, I'm sorry that Andrew Neil thinks the remarks were glib or that it's somehow making fun of the coverage. I mean, that was certainly not my intention. I didn't find any of that amusing. The single thing I found amusing, and I think this is true of a lot of people in this country, is the retired generals sitting for several hours pontificating about things they probably don't know. That was the single element of humour in it. I tried to raise serious points about the danger to families, the danger of simply terrifying people during that attack on Tel Aviv. I'm making the point that if you take the decision to stay on air all the time, you are open to dangers. And there's particular ones. For example, if you ask what I would do instead, I mean, the problem is, during the 9 o'clock news, for example, now, if General Schwarzkopf or someone else happens to come to a podium in Riyadh, the news goes straight over to him. Now, I think that there ought to be certain bulletins each day which are considered, and unless something major happens, just stay there and present the story.
Chris Graham, do you think there is a plot, or do you think it is all unfolding in a confused state in front of our eyes and there's nothing we can do about it? And in fact, the public would rather see it like that.
Well, I'm sure the public would rather see it like it is, and we know that from the audience figures because we're getting record audiences for these programs. And I think if Mark's analysis was right, people would be switching off in large numbers rather than switching to the BBC in the very large numbers that we've seen. Where I really take issue with him is the suggestion that the sort of pitfalls that he's concerned about happen in a continuous program, whereas they might not happen in a scheduled bulletin. But to be fair, Mark says you switch to Schwarzkopf when he comes on during the 9 o'clock news. But I think that's right, because these are very important bulletins, and the audience can judge for themselves.
You don't know beforehand what he's going to say. There could, as quite often happens. In fact, at one point, they just pulled back in confusion from this because some kind of arcane point was repeated over and over again by one reporter. We have no way of knowing, which was my final point in the piece,
was the other day when the Allied
whether any of this is true.
When the Allied forces had captured an island, one of the news bulletins went to a live briefing, I think it was a British briefing, to get an update on the situation. It didn't quite come off because basically the guy had said what he had to say and there wasn't much more. But the 9 o'clock news piece tonight, surely when we know that this major land engagement has taken place, it's natural to go to Schwarzkopf. Where I think you're a little bit unfair is suggesting that this is putting onto the air, as a matter of course, raw, untreated news. Now, actually, we're being very careful and very responsible to make sure that we're not rushing onto the air things that are either going to compromise the military operation or are going to be very distressing to families. There's a lot of
editorial... But that wasn't true of the first attack on Tel Aviv.
What do you think about raw, untreated news? Should it all be mediated, or should we have it, as it were, as it happens, going live to Pentagon briefings?
Isn't the crux of the matter that the media believed the government and the military people when they said it's going to be a 7-day war? And they saw an opportunity to do a repeat of the 6-day war, Monday to Saturday, fill the Sunday papers.
I don't think that's true. I mean, for example, our first headline on the Sunday, 3 days after the war started, our splash headline on page 1 was, "Allies face long and bloody war." And we weren't alone
But
in
how
that
do you
sort of
make the
coverage.
decision, Chris Graham? Because this weekend, you're not going to have the same programming that you've had on last weekend. You are going to return to normal schedules for the most part, apart from short bulletins. So having decided to stay on, how do you decide that it's now time to come off?
Well, if a major land battle then ensues, we'll have to change our mind and go back to continuous news, and Mark will be very cross with us. I mean, at the moment, apart from the events today, there has been something of a lull in proceedings so far as we can see, and then I think we would be in the danger of just sort of analysing ourselves to
Yeah,
death.
I think Chris is being a bit disingenuous about that. What I was saying was exactly the point you've just made, which is that if there is a land battle, it starts on Saturday, that's fine, you clear the schedule. In my view, during the last 10 or 12 days, there have been days when the schedules were cleared and there was nothing going on. That was a different
Right, I
point.
want to move on now to look ahead, because obviously, as Andrew Neil said, it's not going to be over very quickly. That is obvious from the start of the land battles. John Pilger, what do you do in those circumstances when you are starting to take a number of losses? What will that do to reporting?
Well, I hope it'll introduce some truth into the reporting, and we'll get an idea of what war is like, because we've had so many pensioned-off brass speculating on what it's going to be like. We've had very few people speculating on the kind of human tragedy and devastation in Iraq. So far, this is a war virtually without any civilians being killed at all. It's an absolutely wonderful war. So what we're going to find out is that pieces of body are going to be blown up by some of these horrific high-tech weapons, and they're going to belong to our troops. And I think that may begin for the first time to bring home what this war is about, and that it is going to be a hard and clearly long war with a great deal of suffering and degradation. You know, I've got no objection to having the sort of wall-to-wall coverage, but why do we have to, tonight, for instance, have Peter Arnett saying a caption across saying, cleared by the Iraqi censor, and we have these undoubting, excited people going in on Norman Schwarzkopf, who was allowed. Now, you had to go at you had to go at Mark Lawson about being funny, but Schwarzkopf was allowed to make a sick joke on the news today about bombing a bridge in which a truck had just got over. We heard the press laughing. Perhaps that's symptomatic of the
John
kind
Simpson,
of control.
Are we conveying what this war is really about, do you think?
Well, I think one of the things which reporting in a place like Baghdad has done has been, unless I'm arrogating too much to those of us who were there, has been to ensure that precisely because there was so much television coverage and newspaper coverage, there were very few civilian casualties. I think that the journalists can take a certain amount of credit for that, not personally, but as journalists. So therefore, it seems to me quite an interesting twist to an old tale, that the more reporting there is, the chances are the more careful the soldiers have got to be. Now, I dare say away from Baghdad, which is the only place we were able to see, I dare say that the soldiers and the airmen have been a lot less precise in their bombing, but I've got no knowledge about that. I just assume it's probably true.
So coming back, John Pilger, to you on there's been a broadcast and unconfirmed reports that a POW is dead after an attack on a government building. Now, given that we are told that there are only 27 POWs dead, do you think that's kind of a responsible, unconfirmed report, 27 families? I mean, where do you make the humane decision not to
No, I don't. I think the BBC News led with that story, whereas News at 10 put it down the end and said that it could not be confirmed independently, that it in fact had happened. So I think that was a show of reasonable skepticism at last. But whether I would leave it out, yes, possibly I would leave it out.
Mark Lawson, do you agree there have to be certain constraints and restraints on
Absolutely.
on the
I'm maybe more naive than John Pilger, but I think he's saying at last there's some scepticism. I found the coverage of this war, I mean, Andrew Neil commended the reporting, the very good reporting that's gone on, which I said not to refer to, but I made the point that John Simpson's made, that in my view, television reporting and radio reporting has made it much harder to fight a war as generals would wish to fight it. And that's an achievement. And I think that if you take, as one extreme, say, the kind of Baghdad radio which we don't know exactly how trustworthy it is. But then at the other extreme, a kind of Platonic ideal where it was presented exactly even-handedly. British Muslims came on and said why they supported Saddam Hussein. I think the BBC and the British Broadcasting authorities have got closer to that last ideal than they have previously.
Very briefly, John Pilger, because I want to get
of all
Chris
the
Graham to
wars
respond.
I've covered, this is the most controlled. We used to see these people, the Schwarzkopfs and the others, stand up in Vietnam and lie through their teeth about body counts and how the war was going. And it all turned out later on that it wasn't going that way at all. And they're the same people, not exactly, but they come from the same school. They're products of that war in Vietnam, and we've got to ask ourselves, are we being lied to again? I don't think we're answering
Is it going to get more difficult as we have more body bags, more casualties? Is what John Pilger is saying going to happen?
I want to take up, if I may, the point that John Pilger made just before that, which was yesterday's story about the Iraqi radio report that one of the POWs had been killed in an air raid. That's a very good example of the BBC actually behaving very responsibly, because we held that story until we knew from the MOD that all the families who could possibly be affected knew that this is what Iraqi radio was saying. And only then, at 3 o'clock, did we broadcast that. So that's the sort of responsibility that we're showing. There was no way that you couldn't report what was being said when the ambassador had been called into the Foreign Office to be carpeted about it. I mean, let's be realistic.
But I'd also on a general point of the conduct of this war on television, on radio, is it going to become more difficult, do you think, to get the story across?
Because increased casualties will cause heightened emotions.
We're going to have land battles, we're going to have people coming back to hospitals in this country.
Well, I think it's always difficult to report a war, and those who've covered wars will know this far better than I. It's a great challenge. I hope we're doing it responsibly. I think if things get increasingly difficult and emotions are raised, it will make it marginally more difficult, but I don't think it will put us on our mettle any more than we're on at the moment.
Johnson, do you think it will get more difficult? Do you think there'll be more constraints on information that you can put across?
I don't know that there'll be more constraints than there are at the moment, because I think the constraints are pretty heavy, especially for the people working out of Saudi Arabia in a different way from the people working in Iraq. I just think that as the bodies do come back, as alas they will, the kind of emotional level in this country will grow. We'll get the kind of accusations we got during the Falklands War about treason and about betrayal of everything. One of the things which, if I may, I really took great exception to, Mark Lawson, nothing to do with today at all, but to do with 50 years ago, to say that the BBC in the Second World War was like Radio Baghdad is really very bad indeed. I mean, the great thing, it seems to me, a model for reporting things nowadays. I mean, the great phrase the Board of Governors of the BBC said in 1939 was, there must be no ranting. And so far, it seems to me, the little I've seen of the television coverage, there hasn't been a lot of ranting. No. But, you know, we've got to make sure it doesn't come in.
Phillip Knightley.
Yes, I don't think we should forget that the British actually invented censorship. William Howard Russell had reported such dreadful stuff from the Crimea that the new commander-in-chief said we must put the journalist on their honour and their patriotism not to report anything that may be of value to the enemy. And then, of course, realised that maybe the journalist didn't have any honour and didn't have any patriotism. So they imposed the first censorship order, which just said the reporters will not report anything that the military doesn't want them to report. So we invented it, and we're still as good at it as we've ever been.
Gentlemen, for now, from the Late Show, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.